Hello, May edition of the Nutritionist webinar 2016. I'm Marianne Fessenden from Agricultural Modeling and Training Systems, and I serve as your English language host. The purpose of these webinars is to provide access to technical seminars on a range of topics delivered by internationally recognized speakers. The series is a unique three-language presentation held in Portuguese, English, and Spanish. Noted ruminant nutritionists will present in English, hosted by AMTS in the United States, while Marcelo Nieves-Pereira from the University of Lavras hosts for Brazil, as Marcelo Hens Ramos from 3 Lab translates into Portuguese, and Paula Turillo hosts and translates into Spanish for Argentina. There will be a post-presentation question and answer period during which listeners can submit questions through me or Marcos and Paula. A complete recording of archived webinars as well as the question and answer session for each will be available on the 3R Lab and AMTS websites. Pleased and honored to have Dr. Tom Jenkins here today for our May session of The Nutritionist. Dr. Jenkins attended Penn State University for his BS and MS degrees and received a PhD at Cornell University. After a postdoc at The Ohio State University, he then moved to Clemson University, where he continued work on dairy cattle nutrition for over 30 years. Dr. Jenkins taught undergraduate and graduate courses in nutrition and dairy cattle, including basic work on rumen lipid metabolism. He published extensively in scientific journals and conference proceedings and has given numerous invited presentations across more than a dozen countries on lipid metabolism in dairy cattle and the practical aspects of fat feeding. Dr. Jenkins has received numerous awards from Clemson University and the American Dairy Association for his research accomplishments in rumen lipid metabolism. Today, Dr. Jenkins will talk about the utilization of saturated and unsaturated fatty acids by dairy cattle. He is joining us remotely from South Carolina. Remember to jot down any questions you have during the presentation and type them in the Q&A window. I will moderate your questions during the question and answer period. So now, presentation over to Dr. Jenkins.
Very good. Very much, Marianne, and all your colleagues around the world for being in this very excellent webinar series that aims at bringing timely dairy nutrition topics to a worldwide audience. My topic today is on fat feeding, and I want to take this opportunity to share my ideas on how most out-of-fat supplements for improved animal performance. In many cases, people may have bad experience using that supplement or several of them, and that may turn them away from the concept. And I think those issues can be easily solved and dealt with some basic information. And one of the information that's important is the degree of unsaturation in the fat source. With manage the fat supplement for its own benefit. So some general background information on fat nomenclature. I know this is an advanced nutrition series, but for us to start in the beginning with just some general basic information on lipids. I think most have seen the fat content of our dairy rations expressed in one of these two ways. The long-standing measure of total lipid is direct extract, and moved, at least in the U.S., and I hope in many other parts of the world are moving in that direction to dairy acid analysis. Now, it includes fatty acids, but it has a number of non-lipid contaminants as well. Those matter if the sample is not properly dried, and may include pigments, vitamins, carbohydrates, and these are nitrogen. Now, analysis that's offered by commercial laboratories goes elicits those contaminants minutes and go straight to fatty acids. Important. These are the basic units of fat. Just the acids are the units of a protein. These are of animal performance. And you can break them into two categories, saturated and unsaturated, and that helps us a lot in steering these fat supplements in the right direction to get the most out of them. So, saturated, several differences here, different structures. And the base structure of a fatty acid is long chains of carbon down here. And carbon has a oxygen attached to it. And that's the acid group. These are acids, so they are acids, but they're very weak acids. So they're low Rumen pH. The other is the and carbon with 3 hydrogens attached. The one end we designate the beginning, and the beginning and the end. The beginning alpha, the end is the omega. So, for example, this one I showed at the top has 16 carbons in the chain. This has 18 carbons. Still has the 2 oxygens attached, which is the acid group, and then the carbon with the 3 hydrogens, which is the methyl group or the omega. These two most prevalent saturated fatty acids the cows consume. Chain carbons and chains with 18 carbons. Now, convert these saturated fatty acids into unsaturated. Very simple structural change. All we need to do is insert a double bond between the carbons. You can see the saturated on the left have carbons, just single lines attached to them, where on the right has carbons where 2 lines are attached with a double bond. Now this bond is exactly right in the middle of the chain at carbon 9. So count from the omega end, which is carbon with the 3 hydrogens, that's in the end. Count in the number of carbons. We'd have 9 carbons from the omega end to an omega-9 fatty acid. Now another is at the bottom, and this has an additional bond at carbon 6 comes from the end. So counting carbon, 6 carbons reach that double bond, and that makes it an omega-6 fatty acid. Okay. Cannot bond any closer than carbon 9. They can't be closer to the acid end than that carbon 9. But they can put them closer to the omega end. Now, saturated differ in their source. This is a listing of major fatty acids you find in fat sources, starting with 16O and 8 saturated because they have no double bonds, and the rest are unsaturated because they have as many as 6 double bonds in their chain. It also shows a listing of their common names. Now, each fat is a mixture of fatty acids, but it has one predominates, which gives it its signature. So ants usually have more saturated fatty acids like stearate. You can see this in tallow is much higher than it is in any of the plant-based sources. CGS, distillers' grains, is soluble, a byproduct of the ethanol industry. Any source that's based on corn or based on soybean, soybean oil is going to have 18,2 oleic acid as a predominant one. Seed comes with flax, 18,3 linoleic acid as its predominant signature fatty acid. Canola, 18. And fish is unusual that it has these fatties with 5 and 6 double bonds. We call it EPA and DHA. Now, if we forage it, legumes and grasses, and I put corn silage on the end. Put it together, and you can see the forages have 20 to 25% saturated fatty acids. It's only 16.0. So cows are getting appreciable amounts of 16.0 if they have no fat supplements, just from forages. But fatty acid in forages is 18.3, or linoleic acid. That applies to both legumes and grasses. But corn silage for comparison. Corn in the grain is primary fatty acid, and so like I said, 18.2 or linoleic acid is the predominant fatty acid there. Saturated also different from commercial sources. Now, commercial sources were designed originally to avoid rumen fermentation problems. 2 types of fat are toxic to the microorganisms in the rumen, and commercially developed to get around that toxicity. But they all have the benefit of being fats for easy for the mixing, so you don't have to be shipping and mixing greasy, oily fat sources on the farm. Now, the forages in the U.S. Contain most of the commercial fats. A term we call fats. That's misused in many cases. They're not actually krill, but oftentimes under that category. They're mostly saturated fatty acids. A combination of 16.0 and 18.0. And then the other category that contains unsaturated fatty acids. The most prevalent are calcium salts of palm fatty acids. Linoleic acid is the primary unsaturated fatty acid. They still contain a good 16.0, but in addition to 16.0, we have unsaturated fatty acids. Now, the differences in benefits and limitations of saturated and unsaturated. Together generally, and then I want to work my way through this as we go on. Saturated provide ham energy, wheat milk production, less problems on rumen function and pressure. One of the rumen function advantages that we're tuned in the rest is a great deal. When you have acidity and it impairs microbial population, milk fat depression is one of the adversities. You also see acids have less effects on dry matter intake, less effects on milk fat depression, less effects on dry matter intake, but can have lower digestibility than unsaturated in some instances. The fatty acids provide energy. We can have more problems on rumen function, often causing milk fat depression problems, more on lowering feed intake or dry intake, but they often have better digestibility and also omega fatty acids for improved tissue function. We want to work our way through these and take a look at them in a little bit more detail. Before I do that, I did want to mention some saturated and unsaturated fatty acids have in common. There's a benefit. It doesn't matter which category they're in. Feeding too much of them will limit and can reduce benefits, yielding the milk yield, or even worse, causing a drop in milk yield, even if you never fed them at all. And they can reduce components, including milk fat. So, is the key to getting out of saturated and unsaturated. And I wish it was so simple as to have a single number applied across all fat sources. It's not that simple. The problems vary with the composition other factors, as well as composition of the basal diet, and there needs to be a little bit more complexity decision put in the proper amount of fat to feed in order to increase the chances of success. Let's take your favorite nutrition modeling program, which of individual fatty acids by their abbreviations. In this case, many of them also have their names, from low at the top to 18 through the bottom. Saturated top, polyunsaturated at the bottom. This is a TMR, typical TMR, and in this case, the cows were consuming 1,161 grams of total fatty acid per day. Acid consumed is linoleic acid, just short on grams per day. What does that tell you about the TMR? It's most likely corn silage based. The E2 is an indication of corn silage. The SAT 16.0 and 18.0, and I'm leaving out the smaller amounts, 12.0 and 14.0. 16.0 amount 28% of the total consumed. So saturated fatty acid intake is a small proportion of fatty acid consumed. Now let's run to the rumen now. It reaches the duodenum of the animal. Same total amount goes up a little bit from 1161 to 1220 grams. You won't change greatly. The proportion saturated and saturated change greatly. The grams of 18.2 goes down to 15.1. The 15.3 goes down to 3. 16 is very much. But 8 goes from 35 to almost 100 grams. Big shift from in the feed and to leaving the rumen. Fatty acids now accounting for about 73% of the total fatty acids. As a typical example, the prime fatty acid is the cow gets its energy from. Now, why happen? It's because pathway the microorganisms carry out called biohydrogenation. They carry fatty acids in feed, the saturated acid that reaches the intestine, and it's a vitally important pathway because bonds are toxic to the rumen microorganisms. And this way evolved to detoxify which are unsaturated. So it helps protect the microorganisms from toxic effects of saturated fatty acids and preserve cellular digestion, the fundamental reason for the microorganisms to exist. So that's an important pathway, but nevertheless, that greatly changes saturated to unsaturated. So now into the intestine, which are most saturated. Let's take a look, begin to take a look at what they're going to do to animal performance. And we intake, or DMI, dry matter intake. This is from a meta-analysis in 2012. This shows the change dry matter intake due to the addition of the fat. So zero is marked there with the vertical line, indicating from the fat. To the left, a negative change up to about 1 kilogram drop. To the right, positive change, 0.6 kilogram increase. And it's broken by publication by 5 fat sources: cow, megalite, oilseed, krill fat, and other calcium salts. Now, the square indicates the average change in data. The size of the square indicates the number of observations that went into it. The bigger the square, more observations. The larger the square indicates the range. So from this, First, you can see it's rare, the fat supplement, and you get an improvement in dry matter intake. This was krill fat. This would have pushed dry matter intake to the positive side of the line. But the observations for the krill fat were low. So it's to reduce intake, but notice that the lines go from no change and a drop as far as over a kilogram per dry matter intake. Now this is, and it's probably a matter of many of these studies overfeeding type of fat, which we know is going to have negative consequences on rumen function and dry intake. So feeding the right amount is never going to lead to intake drops. So you can utilize those drops in intake. And in this meta-analysis, where all the fats average a drop in intake, still reported in milk yield of kilogram per day. So in intake, the meta-analysis showed an increase in milk. So if we proper amount, minimize intake, we even increase our chances more of positive benefit. To digestibility of the fatty acids. And take a look there between saturated and unsaturated. And I'm summarizing the results of 4 studies. Most in 2004, which was really the numbers that went into CPM. Studied by Glasser. I did one in 1999, and most recent was one in State for 2015. It shows by individual saturated fatty acids 16O and 18O, and the unsaturated fatty acids with 1, 2, and 3 double bonds. So when you look, and we take a look at it, you can see variation from summary to summary. Generally speaking, our numbers are for saturated fatty acids, especially stearic fatty acids tend to have numbers that are high. All the information at the bottom is just to show what accounts for some of the variation across the 4 summaries. I won't get into that in detail, but some of them are summarizing data from only dairy or only lactating dairy or including from sheep. And some of them eliminated fat sources like hydrogenated tallow or whole soybeans with hydrogenated tallow. So that accounts for some of the variation we see. So if I just simply average these 4 data sets, then these numbers shown here for digestibility of these 5 fatty acids, numbers reasonably reflect the digestibility that are within normal limits that were reflected in those 4 data sets. But the one reason most is 18O, and I feel comfortable having the single numbers that are shown here to reflect digestibility of these fatty acids. It's maybe for 18O. That number needs to vary. And left shows how the digestibility of stearic acid went down as the amount that reached the small intestine went up. Starting digestibilities on the low end that were as good, coming from a basal diet without any fat supplements, I'm sure. Digestibilities that were good as unsaturated, and that were averaging more what I reported here on 0.65. For some of this, that particle size has been proposed in the past and had to be reduced by mixing. That's the rumination. The stearic acid is coming from the basal diet, or in other words, biohydrogenation versus supplement. How much come from salt formation and how stearic acid concentration, and how much is the failure to be able to disperse or emulsify it adequately at high concentration. So I think we do need to have some flexibility in the digestibility for stearic acid, but we have numbers we can work with. Just how the ability of total fatty acids shown at the bottom, total digestibility of fatty acids and C18 goes down appreciably when you go from a purine acid, which is 100% free fatty acid, and it shows 100, versus HT, which is the triglyceride, which is like, and having it as a triglyceride greatly reduces the digestibility across the tract. So that's a consideration that can affect the number used for. That's important. It helps us to determine. We need to know digestibility to be able to determine what animal performance is going to be. I'm going to unsaturated fatty acids now. And I want to tell you about how it is animal performance, but specifically milk fat depression. How many things if I just focus on milk fat depression? For instance, we know saturated fatty acids are precursors for a range of metabolites in the body we call eicosanoids and prostaglandins. They have a range of medical physiological effects. So very, very important. We're not about those just from consideration. They can reproductive performance, including pregnancy rate and the synthesis of the prostaglandins. And they cause effects on the immune system, help disease resistance, take energy away from the immune system, maintain the immune system, and make it more available for milk production. Documented, continue to be tested, but just due to considerations of time, we're just going to focus on milk fat depression. Now, issue which is of great interest in the U.S. and I think in the other countries as well. Bioactive lipids are produced within the rumen by the microbial population and the process of biohydrogenation that we've already talked about. Is not a single step going direct unsaturated to saturated. It involves intermediates, and the first intermediate is called CLA. It stands for conjugated linoleic acid. They converted to the second intermediate called trans acid. And then finally, the 18O for stearic acid. Now, under terms of the rumen, it's normal to have these CLAs produced in the rumen. Perfectly normal, they're there all the time. Several of them there that predominate when things are normal. When shifted in the wrong direction, you can reproduce the wrong types called MFIs. MF is the term I'm giving to milk fat inhibitors. By CLAs or milk fat inhibitors. They are normally, but they're in low amounts. Human microbial population gets upset. You produce MFIs, they go to the gland and down fat synthesis. Remember, mammary gland can cause milk fat depression. There is the specific CLAs that have been tested in the dairy cow and their names. And certain names are complicated for those of you that don't work routinely in the lipid area. Apply this. There's at the top that have been infused or injected in dairy cows and associated with a milk fat depression problem. And what you might see the most is the second one, cis9 trans 11, that abbreviates C9T11. It's a normal way. Their amounts normally does not cause milk fat depression problem. That have been fused that do cause milk fat to go down. One of the ones that's talked about the most is the one in the middle, trans 10 cis 12 CLA. That's the T10 C12, and one of the milk, all three of these are milk fat inhibitors. But I use the T10, C12 as an example, and you see a CLA starting with T in this example. In my, as you know, it's trouble. T trouble causes milk depression. What's the accumulation of these milk fat inhibitors? They're the cause of milk fat depression. I divide this in main drivers and fine tuners. The main drivers are the feeding conditions that causes microbial population to change. It's going to take several days or perhaps weeks in order to restore back to normal. So too much or the wrong type of fat, too much, and low room pH. Fine tuners, not connected with this microbial population that can have impact on the milk fat, either increase or decrease. And I've done work on carbonates, potassium and sodium carbonate. They give a positive effect. Palmitic supplements that are of interest in the U.S. now have had positive effects. Yeast salts, ionophores in certain conditions, and high rates of starch degradability can have negative impacts. So I want to focus the most on feeding fat. That's what my time is for today. The wrong type of fat, I said, is a risk for animal performance and milk fat depression. So it's too much is what I want to consider. How do you answer the question? Nutritionists need to be able to answer how much fat is too much. In addition, that I often hear in magazines, trade journals, and even journal publication is 100% total fat in the diet. 6%. If that's a good recommendation. So, slide, example of adding 3.5% soybean oil to a bag that has 3%. So from the basal, 3.5% added, 6.5% total, which follows the recommendation. This was published in 2008 in Dietary Science. Now, no percent dropped very significantly. Of 6.5 to 7%. This is too much fat. So then make the conclusion that 0.5% is too much under all circumstances, and you should never use that much. Well, let's look at an example from 2011 published, where 3.5% of saturated acids were added to the diet, on top of 3% in the basal for 6.5% total, and that went up. So in the pre, 6.5 caused it to go down. In this example, 6.5 caused it to go up. What's the difference here? The main difference is this is saturated. This example is unsaturated. Now, I focus my attention on the two major unsaturated fatty acids that a cow consumes every day when I run into situations of milk fat depression. I call that rumen unsaturated fatty acid load. So we put our heads together early on this to come up with this number, this label, not just mine. It includes one, linoleic acid, 18,2 linoleic, and 83 linolenic acid. And it's a way to monitor these high fatty acids because they're the ones that can be tied in microbial population, biohydrogenation, and generate these bioactive milk fat inhibitors. Too much of these. Now here's an analysis from a commercial laboratory, fatty acid analysis of a TMR from the dairy. Shows the individual fatty acids, 12 at the top, 24 at the bottom. Shows major ones along with several other minor fatty acids. Shows relative bases of these, 100% fatty acids, and also shows their percent of the TMR. So, in RUFAL, I pick out the 3 unfatty acids of the analysis. 18 and 18.3 adds up, and in this example, I get a RUFAL of 3.9%. 3% of the TMR, these 3 major unsaturated fatty acids. Go on to experiencing low milk fat. The first thing I want to take a look at. And then I ask, well, is this too much? Is this too high? I had decided for myself how high was too high. Important decision to make. I based on results from continuous culture studies. I want to show this. I wanted to increase RUFAL in vitro in continuous cultures from the low to high, what it would do to the trouble CLA, T10C12. 6 to 30 observations looked at 3 forces that varied from 0 to 10%. Observations with canola oil added, 4 with corn oil, and 4 with soybean oil. That gave me a range of trans 12 milk inhibitor from 1 milligram per day to 66. Now, it produces several grams in continuous culture. You can't do this in vivo. Big cows don't even come close enough to being sensitive enough to pick up small differences in the CLAs that we can see here. They control it very closely in continuous culture and relationships. And the diets I put in these cultures range from 1.83 to % of the dry matter. And the root interest went from over 1 to 7%. Here are the results. I relate from the bottom on the x-axis the T10 cell production. And these, you can see increase in T10C12, that CLA causes the problem, as I increase RUFAL, and it increases at an exponential rate. So, and you have to think, at what level am I going to start to become, where start? What's the number? I looked at it and I said, I'm going to be safe. I'm going to choose around 3%. Now these are RUFAL 30 milligrams per gram of dry matter. If you divide that by 10, that's 3% of the diet. I'm saying 3% diet. Anything above that, I'm going to say is high RUFAL in a risk category. Anything less than that is in the lower risk category. So, distribution of RUFAL from all samples that were done at Cumberland Valley in 2015, there were 1,252 TMR analyzed. I drew at 3% where my cut is, and that shows the proportion of the TMR samples that were run through the lab in 2015 that were higher in that high-risk category. Now, does that mean all the samples to the right of that red line are guaranteed to have no fat depression? Absolutely not. There are cases. Farms have high RUFAL, but their milk are perfectly normal. Always, I look at the phone number right away and want to see if they're feeding a lot of unsaturated unsaturated fatty acids to the count. It helps me diagnose if fat feeding is the problem or not. This is a breakdown of ingredients in a Clemson QMR that was fed here in the trial several years ago. Corn silage based here, we fed some hay, 2.3 pounds of full cottonseed. I'm sorry about switching units here between metric and pounds, and 0.3 pounds of maple ash. The total is 73 grams per day, which is 0.7% of dry matter in high low risk category. Now, which provides RUFAL? Yeah, we need to focus our attention on the most. There was time our attention would be focused only on the fat supplements and especially cottonseed in this example. The cotton would be labeled as the problem. The breakdown of RUFAL, the biggest contributors of corn silage. There was almost as much coming from the corn grain as it was the cottonseed. From the soybean meal, 60. There was not 48. So you ignore the contributions coming from the diet. They could be RUFAL and enough to push it into a high risk category, even when your fat supplements look like they're not a problem. Now, suppose we had fed corn silage that it was at the high end of its fat. The example was 1.5% fatty acid in corn silage, and RUFAL 7. 3.5% fatty acid in corn silage. And that's different. Now, the RUFAL is pushed from 573 grams per day to 770, or 3%. So it goes from low risk, 2.5, to high risk, 3.5, for nothing more than the fact that we switch sources of corn silage. Now, because if our libraries, we got you on those. Out of one of feed libraries some years ago, I know they've changed now, and they're getting more robust and they're getting reflectability more. But at that time, we've got enlisted several, perhaps, corn silage is varying in fiber and chop length and content. But the fatty acids shown on the right here were all exactly the same for every one of them, 2.2%. So if you get there and you say, I have a depression problem, I'm going to see what my library says where I stand on RUFAL, it may not be giving you a good picture, and you need to do a TMR fatty acid analysis. Corn silage run through Cumberland Valley, I think, at the end of their last corn silage season. So this was 2,481 observations early in 2016. And the corn silage fatty acids number is running from just over 1% to over 3%. The average is 2.1. Maybe it's in your book. You see that they can go much higher than that. And just further examples. This is and they went through Cumberland Valley early in 2016. Going to a 2% to a 5%, averaging 3.73. On a milk fat depression problem, maybe you're feeding corn and corn silage, it's up in the 4.5, 4.5 range. And it's because of your fat supplements. I'm going to give one more example here. That's Stiller's grain, which was through Cumberland Valley was 7% to over 14 and averaging 9.77. So if you have a sample of your TMR analyzed for fatty acids when you're working with these. Now, RUFAL alone and by itself can be the answer in telling us how to deal with milk fat depression. It's because RUFAL is influenced by other dietary factors, not cell, or in combination with other factors. Let me give you an example. This was our team. Results, the bars on the left, were a starch diet, 34% starch, with no or 5 sunflower oil. They were really pushing the limits on this. Which went from 2 to almost 5, but as you will see, the CLA, the milk fat inhibitor that they measured in the Rumen, went from 15% of the total CLA to 53%. Increased RUFAL, push. Now, let's look on the right-hand side. 21% starch. Increase the forage, lower the starch, again, combination sunflower oil. One thing, add our oil to this lower starch diet is going to do to the CLA. Going from the fine RUFAL, no change in CLA. The lower starch gave a lower T212. Adding the oil with all the oil had no effect on the CLA. So starch or higher fiber, I don't know which it is, but in concentrate ratio helps to eat more unsaturated fat and get better effects from it. pH is another factor. The 2009 data showing a drop in pH from continuous cultures from 6 and 5.5, and what happened to 2 CLA. 11, that's a good one. Has no fat problem. The other one does, and it went way up, a significant increase when it was lowered. This is another out of Michigan State. Reported dairy science of 2014. Increase in unsaturated oil from 0 to 2%. You got an increase in the trouble CLA in the room, life depression. But notice how when the pH was lower, we got much more than when the pH was higher at any given level of fat or any given level of RUFAL. So the RUFAL, the RUFAL is influenced by the starch, the forage, and the pH. Imagine anything that you do that affects rumen pH. Rumination, buffers, factors can affect when it's not mixing well enough so that there's selection and maybe engorgement. Can enter to the equation that can affect rumen pH. The graph from the 2010 publication shows the relationship they showed between daily mean rumen pH and that content. Let's start on the right-hand side, where we're reducing rumen from 6.6 down to 5.8. Rumen pH to low, and we can put in milk fat content. A lot of stuff around the line. It's not the only thing, but the line indicates that for each 0.1 drop in rumen pH, there's 0.1 drop in milk fat content. That's how sensitive the CLA production is to rumen pH. I think it's a big factor. Several slides ago, how much fat is too much, and hopefully argument that coming up with a single number like this, the absolute maximum of 7% fat, is going to get us where we need to be. So my recommendation, what I do, I'd like to share thoughts on that. This is up with that answer. Not too much. An equation that I developed several years ago. For content of the diet, of the MR, breast down to dry matter, times water intake of the cow, which is the unsaturated fatty acids in the fat source you're trying to add, times content of the. Okay. Let me examine. This is an excerpt from an actual email that I got several years ago from a nutritionist. It says, I can get you on bakery waste from a cookie plant. I want to feed as much as I can because it's very, very cheap. Feed a third of a pound of a commercial bypass fat, 5 pounds of whole cottonseed. I want to leave those in there. This says that the bakery waste has about 20% total fat, that's FFA, fatty acids, and 0.5% is saturated. That means UFA, in this example, is 87.5% unsaturated. Okay. How much? What would be the answer? How would you answer it? I asked a group of nutritionists at a call several years ago to write down how they would answer it. That responded, 6 said they would eat any, despite my instructions that they had to feed it. 0. 2 of them half a pound, 1 said a pound, 4 of them said 2 pounds, 2 of them said 3 pounds, 1 of them was very optimistic, said 8 pounds. I asked at 0 why you said 0 despite my instructions, and these were the answers they gave. Really, it's out of fear for putting the rumen up and causing milk fat depression. All right, now, okay, but I'll walk us through it step by step. This is total fat down into its component parts. This fatty acid is shown in blue, light blue. 50 pounds of 2.9% fatty acids, which I got by analysis. There is 1.62 pounds. This is coming from the basal ingredients, not in supplements. More than 100 fatty acids just from the basal on this dairy. The red is what I call rumen active fat, which is the whole cottonseed. Rumen active fat. It's the fat or it's rumen active. Rumen active can be toxic and cause a problem. So whole cottonseed, 17 fatty acids, that's 0.88 pounds of rumen fat. That's in the red. The base fat, 0.3 pounds, is 85% fatty acids. 0.26 pounds of fat acids is coming from the commercial fat. 0.62 pounds, whole cotton 0.88, and the commercial bypass fat 0.62. Now, I have one fat that I pay attention to. One I call caloric limit. That's defined as arrow at the bottom. I estimate that my guideline thumb rule is the total feed the cow do not exceed the amount of milk fat they produce. This cow 87 pounds of 3.7% milk fat. That's 3.22 pounds of milk fat being produced. Of all sources that I want to see. If you go with that, I think you greatly increase your risk of especially diminishing return, and that's not profitable for your investment in that fat source. Now, these bars are not touching this line, so they have not exceeded that metabolic limit, 3.22, and there's room to add more fat if they need that line. So that's the first limit, metabolic limit. The second limit is the rumen limit. That's I can't eat too much of this active red fat. It'll mess the rumen up, and that the problems, elevate intake, and perhaps other problems as well. So how do I determine that? 4 times NDF times dry matter intake. I won't details of this. I just show you very, very quickly. So I plug the numbers into that equation. It come up with a 5.9 pounds of whole cottonseed is the max I should feed. Only cottonseed. If I fed waste, no cottonseed, the maximum feed is 3.42 pounds. But he wants to feed 5 pounds of whole cottonseed. I have to leave that in there, so I have to take that into account. 5 pounds of whole cottonseed is 0.88 pounds. 1 pound of fatty acids from whole cottonseed, but I'm not. I'm only feeding 0.88 pounds. So that leaves 0.12 difference I can make up with bakery waste. So the 2 pounds of bakery waste fatty acids translates into a half a pound. And we started at half a pound, and they did well. Eventually increased it to 3/4 pound. I wanted a little bit better, and we stopped at that point. Okay. I want to very quickly talk about these fine tuners that I mentioned. I've done some work in laboratory on adding potassium and sodium carbonate to continuous cultures, and good results with CLAs. As I either potassium or sodium carbonate, notice how the good CLA, the C9T11, goes up. The bad or trouble CLA goes down. And we had in the field too, there's a number of studies where potassium has been increased specifically with potassium carbonate, and in every case saw a 0.3 or better increase in fat. To get laboratory results that showed a drop in the B10, C12. Palmitate, it continues to be studied intensely. In almost every study, the addition of palmitate to the TMR has yielded an increase in milk fat as well. But it has no effect on the population. If you have fat depression, I think the milk is still at the root of your problem. The palmitate gives you some relief, some quick relief from that, but it doesn't solve the root of the problem. You still need to deal with that. And then the rate of starch degradability, and I go from this meta-analysis from 2013 out of Wisconsin, is an example to show ENS in this example, dry corn, and the milk that it gave, and here high moisture corn, and a significant drop in their meta-analysis. So many times, being moisture corn or some corn silages cause a drop in milk fat percentages than I've always suspected. The starch degradability were risk factors, so I tested it in the lab. I used an unprocessed whole kernel of corn that had 7-hour rate of degradability of 48% per hour, or 48% in 7 hours. And then that processed corn so that it had 84% degradability. And then I did it in a continuous culture with 2 fat levels, 0 and 3.3% on the bottom here, and 3 rate starch degradability, low, medium, and high. Results on CLAs just accepted in dairy science, so I hope it will be soon. But look at these dramatic effects on shifting the types of CLA and going from low degradable starch to high degradable starch. The CLA went down from 63.3 to 34%, and a drop whether it was low fat or high fat. And the C12 went from 34% of the total CLAs to 60.1. In summary, just a couple points, main points to remember here. Look on feed ingredients because of the potential insult on the rumen microbial population. That's something we need to avoid. But selecting the proper feed rate. And we can have that insult on the microbial population, be assured they're going to have a profitable return on their investment fat supplement. As a quick look at the fatty acid that potentially can disrupt rumen function, especially in milk fat depression. I use RUFAL greater than 3% as a high category and the potential to increase CLA. The farm that has milk fat depression, I first do is look at RUFAL, because if they're overfeeding unsaturated fatty acids. The farm that don't have milk fat depression may still be feeding high RUFAL, but their milk is able to tolerate. Obviously, their milk is where it needs to be. They have a situation in the rumen environment that can tolerate high RUFAL. Milk fat depression, they're not being their milk fat. High RUFAL may be the cause of the problem. RUFAL balance with rumen pH. We have to look at everything else, not just RUFAL, and continue to learn. I urge you to continue to learn how to limit fats and oils, the most effective supplementation rates, so we can negatively increase negative effects on animal performance. So I want to say thank you very much to all the listeners out there. Thanks once again from me to all the sponsors of this great webinar series that is a month, and I look forward to there may be a question or two here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jenkins. Before we go on to the question and answer period, I have a little bit of details to take care of. Next month, we will be hosting Dr. William Prokop, a nutritionist veterinarian who is frequently called in by industry and fellow nutritionists to help troubleshoot nutritional problems in dairy herds. Ben Attica Veterinary Associates are contracted to manage the Cornell University Ruminant Center under the business entity of Dairy 8. Bill has an extensive experience working with large herds throughout the United States and globally. His talk will focus on his approach to determining and solving nutritionally and management-based challenges to optimum performance. Be sure to join us for the next webinar, June 8th at 6 p.m. And for those of you who are wondering, yes, that is a picture of a cat. He wouldn't send me a picture of himself. He doesn't like to have pictures taken. And I want to alert anybody who might be attending the Cornell short courses. The webinar does occur during that week, and we'll figure out how we can best manage that. I thank the people who made this possible: Tom Tolucci and MTS USA and Global, Marcos Neves Preda, University of Lavras, Marcel Ramos at 3R Lab in Brazil, Paul Territo in Argentina, as well as our translators in each location. It seems every webinar gives us a new challenge. Our generous sponsors make it possible for us to get great speakers and manage the program. We thank our gold sponsor, Ajinomoto Heartland Superior Nutrition through amino acids. Our silver sponsors are Arm & Hammer Animal Nutrition and Verts, makers of Strata with EPA, DA omega-3s, and Prequel with omega-6s. Bronze sponsors are Jeffo, Life Made Easier, Dairy One Forage Laboratory, and Dairyland Laboratories and Quality Liquid Feeds. Before I open the floor to questions, I do have two AMTS-related announcements. Our team will be attending the ADSA July 19th through 23rd in Salt Lake City, Utah. If any of our webinar listeners are planning on going and would be interested in a training session held on Monday, July 18th, contact me or Lynn. Also, we're beginning the planning process for the Nutritionist 2017. Email me with speaker and topic wish lists. I hope to speak with potential presenters at the ADSA meetings. I will now open up the floor for questions. The English language listeners, please type it in question and answer tab, and Paula will ask questions for Spanish language audience, and Marcos will ask questions for the Brazilian listeners, unless we have some sort of audio problem, and in that case, if people just want to type them to me, I can read them as questions. So we'll start with our first question, and this is actually, I'm going to open up Dr. Jenkins' mic. So this is from Tom Taluki. Does to have a target decad or potassium or sodium level?
Very good. Well, decad is useful for lungs when it comes to base balance, lactose, and maintaining high levels of milk production that are certainly independent of what I was talking about for sodium and potassium carbonate for factor production. So making recommendations of decad are not totally to the milk fat compression issue. Now, I know we should be, I'm not a decad expert, but, for decad levels that are the 40s, not low 50s, I often hear, in order, especially cows that are under heat stress situations, in order to provide them the best metabolic advantage for milk production. You're going to boost up your decad. My results show is you can get an extra advantage if you're going to do that with sodium potassium carbonate because of what they can do to the microbial biohydrogenation process and lower the CLAs that can help maintain high milk fat yield. The amount of potassium and sodium carbonates that one would use is going to largely be dictated and limited by their cost, and you use those as you can reasonably use, and then you would push your decad lowering the ends as much as you could, and bicarb and other sodium sources where you would want to be on that.
Okay. I have a question from Alpizar. According to Dr. Jenkins' experience, what could be an advantage of substituting a calcium soap composed of palmistic 45% and stearate 33% and linoleic 8% acid by whole cottonseed? Cottonseed, I believe, substituting the calcium soap for whole cottonseed.
If I understood the numbers right, it was largely saturated.
Yeah, let's see if I can't get that so that you can see it. So down in the question panel, I think. I'll send it to you as a chat.
Yeah. And if I heard numbers right and added them up right, that does make you wonder why you needed to make a calcium salt of this, because largely saturated fatty acid is not to cause rumen function problems to begin with, and some salts are usually the answer to less problems for unsaturated fatty acids that are more of a risk. What is if we want to substitute that for whole cottonseed is really the root of the question. Suppose some risk to us if unsaturated oil, and never, but it's within a or seed coat that many people consider to be much less of a risk to exposure of the internal fatty acids to the microorganism. So they'll treat whole cotton or bypass fat. I'm nervous about that myself. You can chew it, can bring it back up during rumination and re-chew it, and can even be softening of that hard outer seed coat during time. And I think those fatty acids acids, unsaturated fatty acids, can be exposed to some extent. Now, some credit to the hard outer seed coat, but it's not 100% credit. More in the range of like a third to a half, maybe give some credit. So I wouldn't want to count. I personally say I wouldn't replace one for the other on an equal fatty acid basis. I still run oil seeds through my 4 times NDF dry matter intake equation to determine the amount of recommended whole cottonseed to feed, and then boost it up a little bit by 30% to account for the whole seed. As for the calcium salt, you could feed as much of that as you wanted, as long as you didn't exceed the metabolic limit that I mentioned, and could afford to do it. So there's cost with calcium salts, and it depends on the amount of basal fat you want to go with. So just to summarize very quickly, that was kind of an answer. The whole cottonseed I would limit based on the Rumen limit that I presented, 4 times NDF times dry matter intake, divided by UFA times fatty acid. Calcium salt would be limited by cost and not exceeding the metabolic limit. I hope that helps.
All right. If he has more to ask, he could type in a follow-up. Paula from Argentina has a couple questions, and after 3, and then after she asks hers, I'm going to open up the mic for Marcos, because I know that the Brazilian audience will be leaving at I think 7:30, because they're going to continue to talk, and then I have some questions on my side. So just anybody who has asked questions, I will get to you, but right now we're going to go to Paula. Okay, Paula? Speak now? To have Paula type in. I have her unmuted, but I don't hear any noise from her. Paula, I'm going to go to Marcos. Marcos, do you have any questions?
Yeah, we have here. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Dr. Jenkins, for the excellent talk. So the first question is how calcium carbonate can increase milk fat secretion? The mechanism?
And potassium carbonate, you might have said calcium, but I think
potassium, sorry. Potassium carbonate.
Yeah, right, yeah. Because calcium carbonate is lime, and it's not going to do anything for this.
Okay.
The mechanism, we've been tossing around ideas ourselves on how this may work. I think a lot has to do with pH in the rumen. As I already had talked about, Marcos, pH is a very strong regulator of the types of CLA that is produced in the rumen. Potassium carbonate is a very strong alkalizing agent. It can increase pH very quickly and to a degree, much more than potassium than bicarbonate, sodium bicarbonate. So carbonate just increases the pH very quickly, and we are thinking at this point in time that a large part of what it functions to help shift the biohydrogenation in the type of CLA in the direction. Now, that is not to totally preclude that there's not a body or a systemic effect from the additional potassium at the site of the mammary gland. We have not investigated that possibility, so I wouldn't want to totally rule that out. When it comes to the rumen effect and the reason that we see the CLA go round, I think a lot of it has to do with the high pH.
Can I question?
Yeah.
Yes, Marcos,
Okay.
it'll be more efficient to have you ask a couple questions and then I'll go to some.
Okay, I'll make another one.
All right.
So another one is on the, we've talked a lot about analyzing feeds for fatty acid profile, and in commercial lab, how it has been using GC or using an NIR curve? Like NIR technology is a good way of doing it, and doing on TMRs versus doing on individual feeds, and just to comment on that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, both in NR and wet laboratory analysis by GC in us, the method works very well for total acid content. Not as well for a burn of the individual fatty acids yet. Now, several labs are looking at how to use NIR for the RUFAL, for linoleic acid, and linolenic, but they haven't been there yet, to my knowledge. Nothing made public yet. But so the NIR for total fatty acid works very well for that. But the breakdown of the individual fatty acids, they're still using GC for that. That's going to change. That will refine this, and they're going to be able to use NIR for breakdown of individual fatty acids. I'm sure that's not far away. I'm sorry, I forgot. What was the second part of that?
Analyzing individual feeds versus analyzing TMRs. And
right. Yeah. If you're when I go to a farm that's not satisfied with their milk fat levels, the thing to do is get their TMR analyzed for fatty acids and count that RUFAL, because I know summation from all ingredients. You're looking at one ingredient, dangerous, or a couple ingredients. That's dangerous. You could pick the wrong ones. Like I hope I pointed out, you may pick fat supplements, look at them, and you should have been looking at the cornstarch, for instance. So by looking at the TMR, that gives you a composite section of all the ingredients and helps to lead you down the path. Now, you should do individual ingredients. It is in the case of fat sources that have been documented as to their fat content. That goes with distillers grain here in the U.S. That varies, like I showed, anywhere from 6 to 7% up to 14%, and that makes all the difference in the world. As those and the performance response. So that analyzed, or these bakery waste that I mentioned, you should get this analyzed to see what fat content is and the makeup of the fat, so to make good decisions on how much to feed to the animals. But other than that, you don't need to get your corn animally or your soybean meal unless you have problems, and then you start with the TMR.
Do you have any more questions, or shall I ask a few?
yeah, can I make another one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Could you talk a bit about the supplementation of unsaturated fat around calving, like before calving and post calving, like linolenic acid, linoleic, and for how long would you give it, and especially when you calcium, salt switching, soybean oil, like dosage, and for example, you start 20, 30 days pre-calving and go to what, 30, 60 days, or what would be general recommendations?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that was important questions that I didn't have time to dig into, but nevertheless, they're very important fat feeding questions. Different reasons for wanting to put fat pre-calving. They have to do with animal health, post-calving, ketosis and liver and things of that sort, maybe helping to try to alleviate those issues. I don't consistently see the value in putting fat in pre-calving in order to help with those health issues. Consistent rewards that come from putting fat in for two reasons. One is maybe custom the animal to the addition of certain fat sources that he hasn't seen before. Maybe ramping them up a little bit, getting used to it. Maybe a reason to get him in there early, at the time of calving or a couple weeks before calving. But there's reproduction. There is consistent data showing that certain selected fatty acids can provide benefit to reproduction pre-calving 3 weeks or so before calving. And in particular are the omega unsaturated fatty acids. And no products that are commercially available that offer both omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids that both have data that's showing there are some benefits on production. Now there's different reproductive responses from these, but reproductive responses have been reported for both of those products. After calving, continuing them onto unsaturated omega fatty acids has been continued to prove useful for reproduction as well as immunity of the animal. And we think this may have something to do with having to supply shortages of these omega fatty acids that have been robbed from the animal just because of biohydrogenation. As I wrote, biohydrogenation can supply only a limited amount of these omega unsaturated fatty acids reaching the small intestine. And there's times when these may not be enough. So supplementing more of them, getting to levels that has helped with reducing time to first service, conception rates, maintaining viable fish, and a number of productive benefits, and also helping to ramp down the immune system that energy can be moved away from demands on the immune system and get more available for production. All those have been shown to be of benefit.
Oh, Marcos, if it's okay with you, I have a backlog of questions from Argentina. Can I ask them? Okay, I'm going to mute you. So this is from Javier, and it's about milk fat depression. Does it have something to do with the hydrophobic effect on surface tension on the bacterial membranes?
Oh, okay. I've just been doing a lot of reading. Be most closely linked surface active properties, fatty acids, and they penetrate into the membrane of the microbial cell and cause disruption. Fatty acids have these active properties that allow them to better penetrate into the membrane of the microbial cell and get into the lipid bilayer, where lipid cross-link with proteins, and disrupt the integrity of that lipid bilayer. And once disrupted, that in turn shuts down the functionality of membrane-bound proteins, like enzymes that supply energy to the cell and substrates getting in and out. And certain microbial species are shut down from that. It does have, it's good, and I think this goes back to part of your hydrophobic thinking. It's good for this in preventing this and integration into the microbial plasma membrane. And people think that the hydrophobic action might come from it attaching to the surface and competition that goes between the fiber and the cell. And I think that may have something to do with the hydrophobic thinking. That, in the event, these fatty acids are hydrophobic. They're all hydrophobic. They're not hydrophilic. They don't like water and escape water. And so they attach to the microbial membrane or attach to fiber. But into the microbial membrane, because they don't like water, they're going to penetrate in there and cause the problem.
And then another question from Argentina. This is from Pedro. Ultimately, we have been offered new high-fat corn hybrids. Do you think it can turn into a problem in dairy cattle?
Yes, good question. It can. It needs to, I've seen cases where the corn cultivar hybrids have low milk fat depression. For that to happen, the Rumen balance had to be kind of the edge of things. Additional unsaturated fat coming from these high oil corn hybrids have pushed it over the edge. So there's fat in these, and it's unsaturated. I think it's highly available enough in order to cause a problem, and those problems can be avoided by factoring in the amount of fat that's coming from those corn into your overall total fat that's being consumed by the animal per day, and making good decisions on how to back off on other fat supplements. So I would feed this corn if it's advantageous for you to feed it. It's available and its cost is right. I would feed it. It's part of my basal fat supplement, but then make adjustments in my other active fat sources to compensate for it. Don't ignore it. That's the line. Don't ignore it because it can lead to problems.
All right. Check and see if Marcos has any more questions because it's getting close to the time when he would leave. I know Paula has more, and we'll go back to hers, but I'll see if Marcos does. Marcos,
Yeah.
have more?
Yeah.
Okay.
You help here. Do you know if the content of unsaturated fat in corn silage change with the maturity of the plant?
Yeah, does the oil content change with maturity? The oil content of corn silage is, for the most, dictated by its grain content, because most of the oil is in the corn kernel. You have lots of kernels, you have lots of starch in that more corn. I think you're talking about time in the silo, I think, to when it's harvested. Because the harvesting is going to be determined by the variety for the corn kernel, etc. So this is in the silo with length of storage time in the silo. The fat content is relatively fixed at that point. A certain amount of corn kernel in there. The storage, and that's not going to change. Now, what change is the availability of the oil. And with increasing time in storage, we have an increase in the availability of we have an increase in the availability of protein. These become available, and it hasn't been shown yet, but I'm sure it carries on over into the lipid. And will become available as it becomes more available. Comes in contact with microorganisms in the rumen, then it becomes more of a risk for causing problems. Now, we have to take into account this availability. there's no way to do it. But I've been exploring a lab test that would allow us to quantify availability of fat in order to take it into account in our modeling program.
Okay. Do you have any more?
Make me last one before
Okay.
8:30. Okay. So talk a little bit about the use of the ratio of the C1811 to C1810 in milk fat as a matter of Rumen function in herds. And for example, if there are reliable NIR curves to measure milk fatty acid profile in farms, if any group has got a similar curve.
Okay. Yeah. You said 1811, and and just to clarify, for this, what you're referring to is C18-1, that trans 11. Yes, and what that means is it's intermediate of biohydrogenation. Remember my pathway, I said it goes from unsaturated to CLA to trans. And at every step of trans, it can make an 18 that's trans 11 or an 18-1 that is trans 10. 18-1 that is trans 10 comes from the bad CLA, the trans 10 cis 12. So the trans 10 comes from the bad CLA, so the trans 10 is a marker for a bad CLA. So anytime we see trans 10 elevated in milk, it's a indication that the root biohydrogenation has shifted and we've got milk fat depression issues going on. Now, I don't look at the ratio in milk so much, 11 to 10 or 10 to 11, as I look at just the total amount of 10. And the relationship between trans and milk fat content is reliable. The higher the 18, the key goes in milk, the trans 10 goes in milk, the lower the fat, but it drops over linear at a diminishing rate. So when you first start to get overage on trans 10, milk fat drops very quickly, and then as you go high levels of trans 10, you can't push milk fat much lower. That's reliable, and we found too many exceptions for that. Now, I think your question then moved into on-the-farm NIR methods for measuring trans fatty acids in milk. I think that's what you're referring to. And I'm familiar with some of that work that's going on with Dr. Balbano at Cornell University and his efforts to use NIR to monitor individual fatty acids that show up in milk fat. And I saw him just last conference and asked him where he was on the trans fatty acids, and he's not yet at the point where he thinks this is reliable on the farm testing to make decisions about milk fat, but he keeps moving closer on these and hopes that in the not too distant future that we might have some diagnostic tool from milk trans analysis that would be able to sit to us when we have a milk fat depression problem, or even more exciting to me is that maybe it will be an early signal that milk fat depression problems may be coming down the line. But they're not ready yet for that. Thanks for
Okay, so I think we believe in here, Dr. Jenkins. Thanks for your talk and for of knowledge and
yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Marcos, and for all of your questions. We will now go to some Argentinian questions. So going back to, I think we got to a question from Leo. What is your opinion about the use of emulsifiers to increase fat content of diets?
Okay. I think what you're really asking is what do I think about emulsifiers to increase the digestibility of fatty acids? Because they don't necessarily increase the fat content very much, but an effect on how well the fats are being utilized. Is that right?
I'm not sure. Maybe he will chat, or probably it'll take a minute. Why don't we give Paul an opportunity to ask him for clarification and come back to that. In the meantime, I'll go to the next question. This is from Daniel. We have the possibility of using condensed distillers solubles. Fat profile is similar to distillers? ? What would the recommendation in the case of using it in lactating dairy cattle alfalfa-based diets?
Okay. Well, I would need to know, like I said, a lot more about the diet before I came up with a number of recommendations. So let's answer in some general terms. It's a good ingredient to include the grain. It's cost effective for you. You will use as much as you can possibly use, but not to the point of interfering with rumen function. So you can limit this. If you feed too much, you're going to do things totally in the wrong direction, and production will go down. If you come out of it, production will go up, and you'll be able to take advantage of this low-cost ingredient. Now, knowing that it's an alfalfa-based diet makes me hopeful that we can feed higher levels of this, because amounts of hay, especially if it's long hay, very good for allowing more unsaturated fat to be fed. And like I said, the exact amount of it, will be higher with hay, but I would need to know more about the total diet. Everything's in there in order to remember that we're accounting for what fat sources are and the fat content of the other ingredients. Even hay, even Daniel, they have more acids than you think they are. And the opportunity to bring up another point. Animals. And I've been to Argentina on the main pasture-based operation. And the current concentration from the pastures is higher than what they are in the same type of hay. Bean can be higher than alfalfa hay. You can't go failures on alfalfa hay to know what these animals are grazing. So even if it's alfalfa hay, there can be more than you think they are. If it's alfalfa, if they're grazing alfalfa pasture, it can be more than you are. So it pays to get these analyzed. Are you going to make firm decisions on actually how much of this condensed distilled put in there?
Oh, coming back to the question from Leo, your emulsifiers, and yes, what you assumed that it would increase the palatability or the ability for it, not necessarily increase the fat diet.
Okay, all right, good, Leo. And there is interest, or we may be able to add emulsifiers to feed it in hopes to the small intestine, where it can help to emulsify fat, particularly saturated fats more, because their points are high. Okay. A little bit more emulsified there in some situations. Now, yes, in some situations. Now, like lecithin's been considered. Now, the problem with lecithin, it's possible with the choline, and the bacteria readily and rapidly break lecithin down. Just demantle it, breaking down into its component parts. So it's the component parts that entered and never reaches the small intestine, so never has a chance to do good. We would need some way to Rumen protect lesser and similar type of emulsifiers to get them into the intestine. Now, let's get them there. Will they have a positive influence on fat digestibility? I think there's a good answer to that. It's in non-ruminant studies that feeding emulsifiers can have significant improvement in the stability of fatty acids, especially saturated fatty acids. Not shown very well in ruminants because of the microbial breakdown issue. But it is a challenge that I think is worthwhile trying to undertake and try to improve the overall digestibility of the acids. After all, there's room for improvement, right? I've shown you numbers that were in the 70s to higher 70s for fatty acids. We have room to improve. If we can improve those, we can get more energy available to the animal. But we have to overcome lumen breakdown.
All right, thank you. Dr. Jenkins, I've got some more Argentinian questions, but I'm going to circle to a couple questions that Tom sent me a while ago. Why sodium carbonate versus bicarbonate?
Okay. The sodium carbonate response that I have been seeing, reducing CLAs, and because of its very strong alkalizing responses. Its formula is NaCO3, is NaHCO3. That means sodium bicarbonate is a buffer. It's the ability to both accept an electron and donate it at the same time. That makes it a buffer. Because it has hydrogen built into its structure, it can only accept or donate one hydrogen. And sodium carbonate, on the other hand, has no hydrogens in its structure, so it can accept twice the electrons, twice the hydrogens. So it's greater ability to increase pH. But it's a buffer. So carbonate is not a buffer. It can't try to maintain constant pH like buffers can, like carbonate. It can only raise pH, raises it much more effectively because it doesn't have hydrogen in its structure. And Tom knows even more about this than I do, but it's a very good question for the rest of us to think about, and not be sure that we don't try to use sodium bicarbonate as a substitute for sodium carbonate in order to get the same response.
I'm always prodding him to do some CEDAR questions so that we get a good discussion going. Let's see, this question, and I'm not sure I'm going to answer it properly. Again, Tom, sodium or potassium or a blend?
Okay. Sodium or a blend. I think that comes down totally, well, I was going to say the cost, but back off on that. Cost will be one reason why you may want to decide the proportions of each of those that you use. But another consideration. The animal can benefit from the potassium as well. And I think the potassium carbonate is too expensive and I want to stay away from it. The animal can still benefit from it, and it can cost effective. One of those is because the loss of potassium from the animal's body. After all, it's the high in concentration in milk, and then there's additional losses through sweating during heat stress situations, and the animal can benefit from getting additional potassium in there. So it needs to be taken into consideration as well. I certainly would not want to use lithium carbonate out of there because of cost issues. It is more expensive than sodium carbonate. Those are those animal considerations.
I have some questions, more questions from Argentina. This is from Eduardo and Leo. What will be your recommendation in terms of quantities of carbohydrates? In Argentina, we have milk fat depression cases in cows on ryegrass pastures and with autumnal alfalfas.
Okay. Question is how much starch, I think, to put those soy and around milk fat depression. I think we want to feed, but we don't want to get into milk fat depression issues. It's hard to give firm numbers on what is the right amount of starch to feed. It's either you have milk fat depression, and you look at the diet and it's low in fat and it's high in starch to say you back up on starch. It's much harder when you go into a farm situation and they don't have milk fat depression. I want to say how much starch can I feed to avoid having that problem? Because the answer to that depends on so many other factors. It depends on how much you're feeding from other sources, and ryegrass is being one of them. In rice pasture, I've measured fat levels in early vegetative and ryegrass, perennial ryegrass, that were 7% fatty acid, 7% of the dry matter. Down with maturity, down 4% later maturity. So there can be more fatty acids coming in from other sources than you think there are. That's going to affect the amount of starch that you can there. So considerations, pH considerations in the room, and how degradable is that starch source that you remember I showed you data. Highly degradable starch sources pose risk. So our answer to that thing would be for me not to give a number for leading us all to think that all starches are the same and there's only one number to go by. But it's important for us to think that that proper amount of starch that we're going to use is going to vary depending on all these other factors. I know, Eduardo, that makes the answer to this more complicated and not as easy to deal with, but still makes it effective for us to all be thinking about how these ingredients depend on each other in order to have their effective feeding rates, and not just on single numbers. And I hope nutrition modeling programs will reach a point where they're going to be able to take all the interactions into consideration, and they help us come up with these numbers. And I think a number of programs, including AMTS, it's going to be in the forefront of this type of development.
Oh, some feedback I had from Paula. I may be led down the wrong path on that by misreading. The question is about quantity of carbonate, and it's referring to ryegrass lipid content. Does that make it different for you?
Okay. I'm very sorry. My apologies.
Me too. I think I started it off wrong. So
I'll take the blame on that one. I really didn't carefully enough. So quantity of carbonate, grass pasture, and fat depression problems. Somewhere in I thought I heard starch, but quantity of carbonate. I don't think that matters too much. If we think of a pH problem, first of all, if you have milk fat depression problems, you probably need to do anything. Maybe you don't need to worry about decad, and you don't need to worry about getting some potassium into the cows. If you're happy with your milk fat levels, you don't need to do anything carbonate in order to deal with milk fat. Now, if you're having milk fat depression problems, you want to bring some carbonate in. It really matters what the basal diet is. Another problem, you want to try to boost up rumen pH as part of your immediate response to try to get a boost in milk fat levels. And I don't think it matters what the ingredients are. Again, the amount that you want to bring in there is recommendations on this. And the manufacturers, and I'll point out one here, Decaf Plus, marketed by Nutritionist, provides some recommendations on how much carbonate to bring into the diet. And they're talking about an ounce, a half an ounce, and on upward in the sort of levels in order to provide result on animal performance. Don't think it matters whether it's ryegrass or corn syrup or what it is. You want to follow this recommendation.
And this one is from Carlos in Argentina. If we can obtain lab results of their extract different from those on the library, should we keep saturated and unsaturated fatty acid portions? And I think that's referring to the library values for saturated and unsaturated fatty acid portions.
Carlos, if you have analysis done on it, and you change that in your library, so the library now reflects what you're actually using. That means that you ask for full fatty acid analysis, includes the breakdown of the individual fatty acids, and then enter those actual individual fatty acids in there, and it will then calculate the true saturated and unsaturated. And getting back from the lab is just the total fatty acid concentration without a breakdown. Then you could use the same that are in the library, individual fatty acids in the library. And I say that because I'll use corn grain as an example. It varies more in its total fatty acid content than it does acid composition. So the amount of saturated and unsaturated and its ratio stays the same corn grain. You know, the total fatty acid content can vary, like I said, from a couple percent to over 5%. So if the lab doesn't give you that number, just for profile, use the same that's in the library. But it gives you the profile number, go ahead and change it to match your source.
Oh, yeah, and she thinks they're just giving the ether extract number.
Okay. And in the case of just the ether extract number, remember they're not fatty acids. Okay, that's ether. That number is higher than fatty acids. Ether extract is always higher than fatty acids. And really crude, rough estimate, take ether extract -1, estimate acids. It doesn't work all the time, but it is somewhere in the range. And if it's ether extract, you don't have information on individual fatty acids, and just use the number that is in the library for individuals.
Next question is from Javier. As a precursor of reproductive hormones, arachidonic acid from linoleic acid, do we need it at the intestine or the rumen level?
Absorption, get into the tissues and be acted upon by tissue enzymes to 18-2 to arachidonic acid, and then on to the series 3 prostaglandins. So you have to get 18-2 past the rumen, then have it absorbed and make it to the tissues. If it's not getting past the rumen, then it's not going to be any use to be converted to arachidonic acid and then on to the prostaglandins.
Okay. I don't have any questions in my window, and I haven't seen any new ones from Paula. I'm going to take a chance and see if she's able to be heard. Just to thank you, we may be all done unless I get some quick questions written in. So I'm going to try Paula this time. Nope, it's been me. Okay. Yes. I guess I will speak for both Paula and Marcus, and thank you so much for this great presentation. Tom had to leave, and he said thank you so much. We really enjoyed your presentation. I hope that all of the people who listened also got a lot out of it, and we will be sending out the rough recording probably tomorrow, and the recording, which takes out all of this stuff that I'm saying probably, will be out in a bit. Paul says thanks so much, and everybody in Argentina enjoyed it. I will speak for Marcos. I'm sure they all enjoyed it there. We're all eager to get as much information as we can. Thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins, and if I don't get any more questions, I'm going to say good night to everyone.
Very much, my friends in the U.S. and in Argentina and elsewhere, contributing your great questions, and enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
All right, and good night, everybody.